Thank you, Ryan, for the kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be here and to have the possibility to present and to bring the topic of safety into today's presentations. So this is the outline of my talk. I would start with a motivation for the safety test that I will present to you. I will show you the cells, the setup of the test, and then we are ready for the first experimental data, which will be exothermal data from accelerating rate calorimetry. I will then show to you critical temperatures from thermal abuse, which will be followed by critical temperatures from mechanical abuse. And I will give some suggestions of how machine learning could work together with this experimental data, and of course conclude with a summary. On this slide, I have some motivational aspects, but also leading questions for my research and this presentation. So the first questions that we will surely be able to answer is, how can we actually study the thermal runaway behavior? And also I will give you some insights on how modern Type 21700 commercial cells behave in terms of safety. Also, I will compare different cathode materials and also different state of charge and their influence on safety. I will give you some insights on temperatures when critical events such as thermal runaway or venting will take place. And also, I will show you when thermal runaway occurs from mechanical abuse and when it does not occur. We will have a look at the state of the cells after thermal runaway. And lastly, look at how much mass gets ejected from the cells, which is important because it could increase thermal propagation. And on the picture here, you can see our accelerating rate calorimeter after a test with a destroyed cell. And this was from a thermal abuse test. So let's have a look at the samples that I studied. I'm working with commercial lithium-ion batteries of type 21700. They all have the electrolyte salt LiPF6. They all have an aluminum oxide coated PE separator, but they differ a little bit in terms of electrolyte composition. The 5 different cells that I studied are from different manufacturers, and as the main differing aspect is the cathode materials, I will always indicate them by the different cathode materials. The first one is an NMC cell with about 5 ampere hours of capacity. The second one is an NCA high energy cell with also nearly 5 ampere hours of capacity. The second NCA high energy cell is very similar, but it comes from a different manufacturer, and it helps to sort out which is actually the difference of the chemistry and which is the difference of the manufacturer. Then there's one NCI high power cell. This one has a lower capacity of 4 ampere hour, but allows discharge currents of up to 16 C. And the last one in the test is an LFP cell, and the one with the highest capacity I was able to get has an average 3 ampere hours of capacity and allows a discharge rate of a maximum of 3 C. This is the setup of the accelerating rate calorimeter. You can see here inside a blast box, there is the actual accelerating rate calorimeter. It's inside a blast box to prevent from explosion, from parts flying around, and from gases. All of the setup is secured by door sensors so that the test will be stopped if the blast box is opened, and there is a fume extraction at the blast box to evacuate the fumes at the end of the test, and also we are able to cool down the calorimeter after the test. On the right, you can see a side section of the accelerating rate calorimeter, and you can see here in green in the middle is the actual battery, and all around the battery we have heaters. And those heaters allow us to have adiabatic conditions inside the arc and to precisely control the temperature. To do so, we have a thermocouple mounted directly at the battery, and there is another thermocouple at the side of the calorimeter. And during the test, those 2 thermocouples will compare their temperatures from each other, and that's the way how we will be able to detect exothermal behavior of a battery inside the accelerating rate calorimeter. In parallel, we are measuring temperature at other points of the calorimeter. We can measure the voltage of the cell, and as mentioned, we have a pressured air cooling to cool down the cell after the test. talking about the test, this is a schematic view of how the test that I will be presenting, and that is also the standard thermal safety test is going. It starts with a heating step, defined heating step. Most of the cases it's 5 degrees C. You can also see here the different heating steps. And this heating step is always followed by a waiting step that is needed to establish a thermal equilibrium inside the battery and also inside the calorimeter. After the waiting step comes the seeking step. And in this seeking step, the two thermocouples I just presented to you will compare their temperature to each other. And if a self-heating of the battery is detected during this heating step, this seeking step, which is about 20 minutes long, then the calorimeter switches to exothermal mode. And that means that the calorimeter will heat together with the battery, will provide nearly adiabatic conditions and drive the thermal runaway to even faster rates until the battery fire occurs. If the fire occurred, the cell will be cooled down and the test is stopped. And if during a seek step, no exothermal behavior is observed, the next heating step is followed by the waiting step until we finally get some exothermal behavior. The adiabatic conditions that we have inside the accelerating rate calorimeter represent the worst case. That is much worse that you can get in any battery pack. Therefore, they are ideal for safety assessment, but do not correspond to any conditions you will have in a battery pack exactly in that way. We can find precise temperatures of critical events. They still match the real world, those critical events. And we can also quantify their temperature rates, which is very helpful to understand the reactions running. Therefore, we can conclude that thermal runaway analysis by means of accelerating rate calorimetry is a proficient way to assess cell safety. Now, I won't let you wait any longer to show you some experimental results. And the first results I'm showing is exothermal data. Exothermal data is only acquired, it's quite logical, when the cell is exothermal. So the data you see here does not start at the beginning of the test, but start at the beginning of the exothermal behavior of the battery and goes to the thermal runaway. In this graph, on the left axis, you can see the capacity normed temperature rate of the reaction, and on the right axis you can see the temperature itself. Each graph is for one specific state of charge. So all of the data presented here is for state of charge 100, and in the different colors you can see the different cathode materials. As mentioned at the beginning, we are comparing NMC, two different manufacturers of NCA high energy cells, one NCA high power and one LFP cell. And as you can see, we conducted several experiments per cell type. And yeah, what can we see in this experimental data? Maybe the first thing, the blue reaction is significantly shifted to the right. Those are the LFP cells. So that means that the LFP cells react later at a higher temperature. And you can also see from the slope of the reaction that they have a slower reaction speed, especially in higher temperature rate zone. The second thing that comes to the mind is the green data, which are the NMC cells, because they are the ones that start first with the exothermal behavior. This means the NMC cell is most reactive at the beginning and stays most reactive over most of the phase of the temperature rates. But just before thermal runaway, the NCA cells become faster. And so at the end, we have the NCA high energy cells going into thermal runaway a little earlier than the NMC cells. This is the same representation with the same cathode chemistries, but now with a new test series where all cells were charged to a state of charge of 80%. And once again, you can see a slower and a later reaction of the LFP cells. And especially you can start to see that the LFP cells do not reach certain temperature rates anymore in all of the tests. Most reactive at first, but later thermal runaway is once again the NMC cell. And the first thermal runaway is the NCA high energy 2 cell. We have a very comparable exothermal reaction for a state of charge of 80 for the NMC, the NCA high energy 1 and 2, and the NCA high power cell. As you can see here, they are really very close together over the biggest part of the exothermal behavior. And just at the start and at the end, they differ a little bit. to spare you all of the state of charge I tested, the last state of charge I'm going to show to you is SOC30. And that one is very interesting because that is normally the state of charge where the cells are transported. So this is the one if you want to know about when the next ferry is burning because of electric vehicles. So what you can see is that the LFP cells have a much different behavior once again, but in this case, they do not reach a reaction rate that can be considered as thermal runaway. There is a thermal decomposition taking place, but no thermal runaway. And we actually went until 350 degrees. But everything what was still happening here was just a little bit up and down and measurement noise. So there was no decomposition reaction from the LFP cells. They stopped thermal decomposing by themselves, even though we continued to heat. So that's why we considered that they do not have a thermal runaway at SOC30. However, for the other cells, we observed thermal runaway. In this case, most reactive cells at the beginning is the NCA high power in orange, but once again, it's the first to react here. In this phase, it's pretty reactive, but then it goes into thermal runaway later than all the other chemistries. And as you can see, all the rest have a pretty comparable exothermal reaction in that zone, so it doesn't matter if it's an NMC or an NCA high energy cell. To conclude from the exothermal data is that LFP is much less reactive for all state of charge. NMC has the earliest exothermal reaction. However, NCA high energy cells go first into thermal runaway before NMC cells. And in general, the NMC, the NCA high energy and NCA high power cells behave comparably. Now, let's have a look at some critical temperatures of the thermal abuse. So we are looking again at the same experiment, but now we are not looking at the temperature rates, but at different important temperatures. And we will compare them between the different cells. And now in one graph, you will see different state of charge. Let's start with the onset temperature. The onset temperature is the temperature where the cell starts to behave exothermally, and more or less in all of the literature, the definition used is a self-heating that exceeds 0.02 degrees C per minute, and that is also our definition for the onset temperature. So what you can see in these graphs, on the left axis is always a critical temperature. Here it's the onset temperature. And on the right axis, you can see the different cell chemistries compared. And in color are the different state of charge. And there's also over all cells a mean, a maximum, and a minimum given on the side. The onset temperature is decreasing with higher state of charge, meaning the cell get more reactive as they are charged higher. What is interesting is that LFP does not show a clear state of charge dependence and has an overall much later reactions than the other cells. NMC is the most reactive cells in terms of onset, except for a state of charge of 0, which is indicated in blue. There, the NCA high energy cell is the earliest. What is interesting is if you look at the arrow bars, except for LFP, this is quite well reproducible between the experiments. And if you consider the average value on the right, you can see that at about 100 degrees C, if you don't really know what you have inside your battery pack, the onset is occurring. The second critical temperature that I like to show to you is the venting temperature. I guess all of you know, venting of cylindrical cells is intended to be a safety device. However, the venting gases contain hydrogen, hydrogen fluoride, and also different hydrocarbons. And therefore, the venting gases are toxic and explosive. So venting is a safety device to prevent cell rupture, but the venting itself can be harmful for passengers. The venting temperature decreases also with higher state of charge, meaning the cells emit toxic gas earlier if they are more charged. LFP, once again, does not show a clear state of charge dependence and has an overall much later venting than the other cathode chemistries. NMC and NCA high energy 2 have the lowest venting temperature. And I guess everyone was awaiting it, the start of thermal runaway temperature, the moment where the cell goes into a rapid reaction and a battery fire is about to happen in less than a second. And what is interesting here is that for a state of charge of 0, all cell chemistries do not go into thermal runaway. We tested this until 350 degrees C and stopped heating then, but we discussed with a few colleagues, and it is not to be awaited that there's a thermal runaway at a higher temperature, because all of the electrolyte is already evaporated at this moment. Even at a higher temperature, no thermal runaway to be expected. What is interesting and new is that we showed that for LFP cells at SOC30, also no thermal runaway occurs. Thermal runaway decreases with higher state of charge, meaning the battery fire occurs earlier when the battery is charged higher. And this is actually a function where that also works for the LFP cells. Not as good as for the other cells, but it still works also for the LFP cells. And once again, LFP reacts much later, but it still reacts. To summarize the findings on critical temperatures for thermal abuse, there's no thermal runaway for state of charge 0. The thermal runaway behavior is governed by the state of charge, and LFP cells behave differently and react about 50 Kelvin later than the other cell types. So at the end of each experiment, beside a lot of data, we have some destroyed cells. And so we had a closer look at those cells and did a post-mortem analysis and started to give categories for the different states of the cells that we found. Therefore, we assigned different grades of destruction to the cells, and also we systematically looked at the mass loss. So from 0 to 6, you see the different grades of destructions that we assigned. 0, there is still the plastic around the battery, but it changed color. 1 is a blank battery. 2 is where you can see molten plastic on the outside of the battery. 3 is already a burnt battery, and you can find often some aluminum getting out from the inside of the battery. State 4 is where actual battery parts are missing. So in this case, the positive terminal is missing. State 5 is when we have an ejection of the jelly roll, partly or fully. And state 6 is a completely destroyed battery, side rupture, or other complete destruction. And here you can see on the left indicated the mass loss for the different cathode chemistries and the assigned grade of destruction that I just presented to you for the different cathode chemistries. To start with the mass loss, that's the easier part. With a higher state of charge, there's a higher mass loss. But the highest grade of destruction does not occur for the highest state of charge. We found the highest grade of destruction for SOC30. A way to explain this is that SOC30 has a later thermal runaway. Therefore, we have a longer exothermal reaction before the actual thermal runaway, which could lead to a higher grade of destruction because of a more powerful explosion inside the battery. But that is interesting. If you try to optimize for thermal propagation, you have to keep in mind that you might not have the least parts of the battery flying around when you have a low state of charge of the battery. Now let's go away from the thermal abuse test and go to mechanical abuse testing. This was done by nail penetration test, and on this picture you can see the setup of our test. So this is happening inside a much larger calorimeter. You have the battery here with the thermocouple and the nail penetration device here, and we are also filming the experiment. We have a stainless steel nail with a diameter of 3 millimeters and a speed of 10 millimeters per second. That is at least beyond the cell radius put into the battery. And here on the right, you can see how this experiment is looking on a temperature over time scale. At the moment where the nail penetration is happening, we immediately reach a very high temperature. The temperatures exceed 1000 degrees C, and immediately after that, the cell cools down. All the reaction happens in a very, very short time frame, and after 5 minutes, we are already below 100 degrees C. Let's once again compare the different cathode materials and also have a look at how the state of charge influences the nail penetration. You already know this representation. overall maximum temperature on the left, different chemistry here, but now we have a little bit different state of charge. For this kind of test, we used 0, 30, 50, and 100% state of charge to compare. And for the overall maximum temperature, so we have different thermocouples mounted on the cell. This is the one over all of the different thermocouples. We can find very low temperature and no destruction for SOC 0. So you can see here, it stays below 100 degrees C. So there's actually just electrolyte getting out, a little bit of vapor, a little bit of boiling of electrolyte, but no fire, no smoke for all of the cells at SOC 0. And for all state of charge, for the LFP cell, this is what is happening. This is already well known for LFP cells, that they do not go into thermal runaway from nail penetration, but we were able to demonstrate it again for type 21700 cells, and it was interesting to compare it to the other chemistries. The highest temperature we found was for NCA high power cells, and that one always reached around 1200 degrees C, which is very interesting if you think about means to put out an actual battery fire that has those temperatures. The use of water can be put into questions, and also you might have seen some devices that firefighters use to get into the battery pack, which are, in my opinion, highly questionable, because they will immediately get the batteries to 1200 degrees C by using those devices. To summarize, no thermal runaway for SOC 0, no thermal runaway for LFP, and we are able to find temperatures above 1000 degrees C for cells charged to SOC 100. As before, we did the same postmortem analysis for the mechanically abused cells. Those are the same categories, and it's the same representation. Once again, on the left, you have the mass loss, and on the right, you have the grade of destruction. Now the variation gets higher. This is due to a much higher grade of destruction from the mechanical abuse. But still, for the mass loss, you can see with a higher state of charge, most of the cases we have a higher mass loss. But once again, the highest grade of destruction is not at SOC 100. In this case, we found it at SOC 50. So that is a little bit harder to explain. And we do not have so much support on this, and maybe understandably are not able to get a lot of more data from this very short test that just leaves the destroyed battery behind. But we think that with this lithiation state, a different gas composition must change the way the battery burns and bring it to a more explosive burning instead of a continuous burning that leads a lower state of destruction. But I'm very happy to discuss this. So what about machine learning in all this? There is some need for machine learning from those experimental data, and this directly comes with the thermal runaway reaction and also with the exothermal reaction rates that I showed to you. During the thermal runaway, we have 10 different chemical reactions. They take place in parallel or are coupled to each other, because the decomposition products of one reaction will be used for the next reaction, or the heat from one reaction will allow the next reaction to take place. We have reaction speeds of above than 1000 degrees C per second. We have at the end the explosion of the battery sometimes happening, which is never perfectly reproducible. And at the end, we have a destroyed battery. On the other side, what we are able to capture with our accelerating rate colorimeters is the temperature rate and the temperature. We have up to 20 to 30 degrees C per minute, a very accurate tracking, and also adiabatic conditions. Above of this temperature, we try our best, but of course the tracking is limited and no perfect adiabatic conditions will be present above this. And we have very large measurement files. I looked up from the biggest one. I found one with 250,000 entries per single test. And in this presentation, I showed you about 100 abuse tests. So there is a lot of data generated, and it masks some reactions taking place. We are not able to link all reactions properly because of all the reactions taking place in parallel, because of the coupling of them. So therefore, we think that machine learning could identify more links and patterns that are unknown, and they can also treat those large amounts of data. So we would like to suggest a path from experiment to machine learning. We suggest, therefore, the publication of validated raw experimental data. Validated in this case means that the one who carried out the experiments made sure that the data published is at first valid, and also that this experiment is a valid experiment. I think you can imagine that with thermal abuse tests, there is some experiments that don't give reliable data, that you can lose the thermocouple connections, and therefore you cannot publish, or not all experimental data should be published, but there should be a critical view on which experiments can be used for machine learning, for simulation, and that's what I mean by validated. But I think, or we think, they should be published. Machine learning should be used to increase the understanding, and maybe we can even train an artificial intelligence that will be able to identify the chemical reactions running. Of course, this needs to be done in an open access way, and together with explanation and metadata of the experiments and a discussion of the errors and the accuracy of the measurement. So the workflow will be, we have our thermal abuse experiment, especially the temperature rate over temperature data that should be checked for validity. What we already did is that we used the data for our own calculations. We calculated entropy, we calculated Arrhenius activation energy, and published this data in an open access way together with our explanation. What we also did is we published the raw data of these experiments on Zenodo. What we are just waiting for is that someone from you is taking this data and runs machine learning on it. So please feel free to do so. Those are the QR codes to immediately download the data from Zenodo. Feel also free to contact me if there's any more experimental data that I could supply to you. We have a lot of it. And we are also doing much more thermal abuse tests than I'm showing to you. Yeah. To summarize, accelerating rate calorimetry, or short ARC, is a proficient way to assess cell safety, and we can compare different thermal runaway behavior. The state of charge governs the thermal runaway reaction, and at zero, no thermal runaway is observed. NMC cells were the most reactive and started exothermal reaction the earliest. Most critical temperatures occur at lower values than other chemistries, with the exception of the start of thermal runaway temperature that was lower for the NCA cells. Those NCA cells reacted faster than NMC, above 1 degree C per minute, and reached thermal runaway a little earlier, but they reacted slower than NMC, below 1 degree C per minute. The LFP cells reacted only at higher temperatures. No thermal runaway was observed at state of charge 0 and 30 for thermal abuse, and for mechanical abuse, for all state of charge, no thermal runaway was observed. We were able to quantify for type 2100 cells where and to what degree LFP cells are safer than NCA and NMC cells, and we published the raw experimental data on Zenodo. New findings on the grade of destruction from thermal runaway were shown, and we think that machine learning should be used to find links between complex experimental data. Thank you for your attention.